First and foremost, the big difference comes whether you're going to fish rocks or fish flats with grass. For strictly rock pile fishing, like on Lake Erie, places on Lake Ontario and Lake Michigan, I mainly use a 90-degree jig head tube jig. Here's an example of that. By 90 degrees, what's meant is the angle of the hook point from the eye down the shaft is a 90-degree angle. In contrast to that, for fishing around grass and on flats, I mainly use a 60-degree angled head. Now you can see the difference between the 90 and the 60. The angle is different. The main reason for that is a 60-degree angle head will come through grass and weeds a lot better than a 90. A 90, the grass gets caught right in that 90-degree angle, whereas a 60, the bait slides through the grass a little better. Now obviously we're talking about sticking all these inside jigs. The 90-degree bend when fishing deep structure, stick it in the tube. That's kind of a crude way of rigging it real quick there. But a 90-degree bend, when I lift my bait, lift my jig up, the bait doesn't glide as much on the bottom. It actually tips. That's a factor that most people really don't consider. Whenever you're dragging a tube jig around rocky structure for smallmouth, every time it tips, it looks like a natural defense mechanism of a crawfish. It looks like a goby trying to scurry up underneath or around a rock. Tipping baits catch you a lot of fish. Plus a 90, when I jig it, it doesn't come way up off the bottom. It kind of lifts and falls back down. So that's a big difference between 90 and 60. Now we were just talking about the difference between 90-degree angled jig heads and 60-degree angled jig heads when fishing with tube jigs. I want to show you a few variations of tube heads that I use for different situations and tell you exactly why that is. The one I showed as a 90 is just a pure cylinder style head. But there's variations in that too. This, all the lead is in the forward section of the head, whereas on this 90 degree, the lead is tapered throughout the hook. Both of these weigh 3/8 of an ounce, and both of them have a pretty similar hook, which we'll talk about. But because of the taper, because that lead is spaced further back in that jig, the action of the tube, instead of up and down, will be more of a glide and more of a potential spiral on the fall. But if I'm fishing in real deep water for smallmouth on the Great Lakes, fishing around rock piles and potentially rough water, the last thing I want is for my bait to come up off the bottom. It's hard enough to get a bait to the bottom in 5 and 6 foot waves. So in that case, you want most of your lead forward on the hook. That's the reason that I have designed, for me, these old style pill heads. Now if you look at those 3 different heads, they kind of go from most tapered lead to least tapered. In the pill head, all the lead is in the front of the hook, and most of it is actually forward and below this pull point of the hook. And what that means is when you pull the pill head, it really tips back and it makes short little movements on the bottom, in contrast to one that would glide more. So from just working my bait in rock piles on the bottom, with a pill head, I could really stay in contact with the bottom. Is I see people use jigs that really twist their line. And it's true, a tube does spiral some and will twist your line. What you want to do though, is when you rig a bait, you want the eye and the hook point to be in line. Okay, that one's real close. Let me show you a little bit about how to do that. Take your tube, take your jig. I usually actually spit on my jig. Gives it a little bit of lubrication to go up in the tube. Push the tube in the bait, okay? And then what I do is I search for the exact tentacles of where I need to put that jig head so that I'm all lined up. And then I'll actually, you can see on this jig it's already tore a little bit, I'll tear that hook point through. So I've actually created a little gap there, and that hook rests real nice and straight. That'll reduce the amount of line twist you get. It'll reduce the spiral of the tube, and more importantly, when you do hook a fish on it, it really lets the tube fold over so you get the maximum hook penetration. So that's a little crash course in tube jigs and in different heads. As you can see by my box, I've got heads for every application in here for a day of fishing. Everything from the giant 3/4 to the little quarters for most of my applications on Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair and the Great Lakes. And the other thing is, I keep them in a waterproof box. I think that's a no-brainer with the cost of jig heads and things these days. You need a box like this one that's got several latches and has got a waterproof gasket all the way around it. Because you've got a lot of money invested right there, and just a little bit of water will just ruin your day. I'm Joe Balog. It's a little bit about Great Lakes smallmouth fishing, a little crash course on tube jigs and how to select the right head for your style of fishing.